Without providing any proof, Elon said USAID is a criminal organization.
And we have to remind the folks in the American public that the FBI reports to the Department of Justice, and the FBI does not make prosecutorial decisions.
In recent weeks, more stories have surfaced that put the United States Agency for International Development, commonly known as USAID, under intense scrutiny. Public attention grew sharply after a string of allegations and leaked documents suggested the agency may have been involved in activities far beyond its original mission. While the FBI has clarified that it reports to the Department of Justice and doesn't make prosecutorial decisions, comments from prominent voices like Elon Musk and former intelligence officials have drawn new attention to the agency's past and present. USAID was set up in 1961 under the Kennedy administration. Its purpose was fairly straightforward: to provide aid and resources to countries in need, help lift struggling regions out of poverty, and support development in line with democratic values. At the time, America had established itself as a global superpower, and offering international assistance seemed like both a noble and strategic move. The aim was to share the prosperity and stability of post-war America with the rest of the world, especially developing nations. By contributing to health, agriculture, education, and infrastructure, USAID was supposed to act as a helping hand rather than a controlling force. However, what was meant to be a humanitarian mission has, over time, been accused of becoming something far more complex and controversial. Critics now argue that USAID, intentionally or otherwise, has often served as a front for secret operations and political interference in foreign countries. These are serious accusations that, if true, challenge not just the credibility of the agency, but the ethics behind international aid in general. Some of the earliest claims trace back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, a time when the world was deep in the Cold War. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union had spilled into nearly every part of the globe. Both superpowers were competing not just militarily, but ideologically. Capitalism versus communism. During this time, countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa became battlegrounds for influence. It's in this context that USAID's role started to come under question. According to several declassified documents and independent investigations, the agency was allegedly used as a cover by American intelligence services to conduct political activities in countries that were at risk of falling under Soviet influence. One of the earliest and most cited examples is Chile. In the early 1970s, the political situation in Chile was highly unstable. The elected president at the time, Salvador Allende, was a Marxist, and the U.S. government was worried that Chile could align more closely with the Soviet bloc. Reports suggest that USAID was actively involved in funding groups that opposed Allende's government. On paper, the money was meant for development projects and humanitarian support. In practice, it's alleged that some of these funds were redirected to organizations aiming to disrupt and eventually replace the existing political leadership. These weren't rogue operations by isolated actors. Former officials and whistleblowers have pointed to an organized effort where intelligence agents operated under the banner of USAID to gain access to key figures and collect political data. That information was then used to plan strategies for installing leaders who would be more favorable to American interests. Critics say this blurred the line between diplomacy and manipulation. While Washington hoped to prevent the spread of communism, the people living in these countries were often caught in the middle. They welcomed aid, but they didn't sign up to have their political systems quietly influenced from the outside. A similar story emerged years later in Cuba. In 2009, an American contractor named Alan Gross was arrested by the Cuban government. He was accused of setting up illegal communication networks without the proper permissions. At the time, this seemed like a harsh response to what sounded like a digital freedom initiative. But things took a different turn when it was revealed that Gross was working on a USAID-funded project aimed at providing satellite internet access, deliberately bypassing Cuban government controls. While internet access might seem like a harmless and even helpful idea, Cuban authorities saw this as a threat to national security. They argued that it was a covert operation designed to spread political dissent. Years later, further documents emerged suggesting that Gross's mission was part of a broader strategy to weaken the Cuban government from within by helping citizens communicate and organize outside of state-run channels. Once again, what appeared on the surface to be a humanitarian effort was alleged to be a politically driven operation. The controversy didn't end there. In 2010, reports surfaced about a social media platform launched in Cuba called Zunzuneo. It was often referred to as Cuban Twitter and quickly became popular among younger Cubans. The app offered messaging features, news updates, and a way to connect that felt independent from government oversight. For many users, it was a refreshing space where they could speak freely. However, investigations later revealed that the platform was not entirely what it seemed. Zunzuneo was allegedly funded and managed through USAID, though the project was masked by layers of contractors and fake companies. The aim, according to leaked reports, was to build a following and then steer the conversation toward dissent against the Cuban government. If true, this would mean that young Cubans were unknowingly participating in a platform designed to influence their political opinions on behalf of a foreign government. When these revelations came to light in 2014, USAID denied any wrongdoing, saying that the project had been transparent and legal. But many in the international community saw this as a form of digital espionage. Even if the goal was to promote freedom of speech, the method raised ethical and legal concerns. Was it right to disguise political influence campaigns as tech-based humanitarian work? These examples raise broader questions about the role and reach of USAID. Was the agency always aware of how its resources were being used? Or was it being used as a convenient cover by other branches of the US government? The truth may lie somewhere in between. USAID has undoubtedly provided life-saving assistance to millions of people across the world. But the blurred boundaries between aid and strategy suggest that in some cases it has played a dual role, offering help on one hand while serving hidden interests on the other. What's perhaps most concerning is how these actions, even if carried out with strategic intent, can damage long-term trust. When people in developing countries start to associate humanitarian aid with hidden agendas, it becomes harder to build genuine partnerships in the future. Aid stops being about shared progress and starts to feel like a transaction with strings attached. After the events of September 11, 2001, the United States ramped up its global presence, especially in regions like Afghanistan and Pakistan. As part of its long-term plan to counter terrorism, the U.S. government sent massive amounts of aid to rebuild local communities and win public trust. USAID played a key role in this. Officially, its mission was to deliver food, medical supplies, and infrastructure support. However, years later, it was revealed that not all of the operations in the region were as straightforward as they appeared. In 2011, the Washington Post reported that a vaccination program in Pakistan, organized under the banner of USAID support, was in fact part of a secret effort to collect DNA samples. The operation was allegedly designed to locate Osama bin Laden by comparing local DNA to that of his known family members. While the goal was to assist in tracking down the most wanted man in the world, the consequences were long-lasting. Many people in Pakistan began to distrust vaccination campaigns, believing them to be fronts for intelligence gathering. As a result, efforts to combat deadly diseases like polio were set back significantly. Health workers faced growing resistance and, in some cases, direct threats. Even today, there is lingering suspicion in certain regions about the true intent behind health programs run or funded by foreign agencies. This incident highlights a central dilemma. Using humanitarian aid as a cover for strategic operations may achieve short-term goals, but it can severely damage trust and cooperation in the long run. Another major case that raised eyebrows occurred in Venezuela in 2019. The country was deep in crisis at the time, with shortages of food, medicine, and basic resources affecting millions. President Nicolas Maduro faced strong opposition at home and abroad, and the United States openly supported efforts to remove him from power. In response to the humanitarian emergency, USAID announced a large-scale aid package, including food and medical supplies, valued at over $56 million. On the surface, the aid seemed like a much-needed lifeline. But according to investigations carried out by independent journalists and some leaked documents, a portion of the money was allegedly redirected to support groups that were actively working to overthrow Maduro's government. The Venezuelan administration accused the United States of using humanitarian aid as a political weapon, a claim that many dismissed at the time. But later confirmations from neutral sources added weight to the possibility that the aid program was being used for dual purposes. These kinds of allegations have made it harder for people to separate genuine relief work from covert political strategies. Once a government suspects that outside help might come with hidden motives, it becomes far less willing to allow aid groups to operate freely. In the case of Venezuela, the government eventually rejected further assistance from USAID, claiming it couldn't accept help that came with political strings attached. Looking back even further, there's the case involving the Harvard Institute for International Development, which collaborated with USAID on a project in Russia during the 1990s. The goal was to help Russia transition from a Soviet-style economy to a more open, market-driven system. On paper, it was a noble mission, supporting economic development in a post-Soviet country struggling to stabilize. However, things reportedly went off course. According to investigations conducted by Russian authorities and later reported by multiple outlets, individuals linked to the project were accused of misusing their access to private economic data. The claim was that some members of the initiative had used insider knowledge to profit personally, by manipulating investments or selling sensitive information. This scandal caused major friction between Russia and the United States and eventually led to the expulsion of USAID from Russia in 2012. Officials there argued that USAID was interfering in their domestic affairs and that trust had been irreparably broken. By 2021, USAID was again in the headlines, this time for supporting a Michigan-based charity that was later found to be involved in corrupt practices in South Asia. Though the donation in question was just over $100,000, it raised fresh concerns about how the agency chooses its partners and whether there are sufficient checks in place to prevent misuse of funds. Critics, including high-profile figures like Elon Musk and Senator Rand Paul, began openly questioning the accountability of USAID and other aid agencies that receive funding from Congress. Senator Joni Ernst, another vocal critic, cited several instances where USAID spent large sums on questionable projects. These included hundreds of thousands of dollars on pottery classes in Morocco and what was described as an overly expensive version of Sesame Street created for audiences in Iraq. While such programs might have cultural or educational value, many Americans questioned whether they justified the millions spent, especially given the financial pressures facing communities back home. The focus on how taxpayer money is used has become even sharper in recent years. People are increasingly asking not just where their money is going, but what exactly it's achieving. In some cases, the outcomes seem unclear, or worse, counterproductive. The issue of media influence is also worth discussing. In countries like Ukraine and Nigeria, USAID has been involved in funding local media outlets. In theory, this helps support independent journalism and improve communication in regions that need reliable news. But in practice, some reports suggest that funding came with restrictions. Journalists were allegedly discouraged from criticizing USAID-funded projects, and in some cases, financial support was withdrawn when negative stories appeared. In Ukraine, this reportedly happened in 2015, when the country was still recovering from conflict and political upheaval. Media outlets that had previously received USAID support found themselves cut off after publishing articles that questioned the effectiveness of foreign-funded programs. A similar pattern occurred in Nigeria in 2018, when USAID helped fund water projects in rural villages. While the initial media coverage was overwhelmingly positive, follow-up reports that pointed out delays or technical issues received far less attention. It later emerged that some outlets had agreed not to publish negative content in exchange for continued funding. These claims suggest that USAID, intentionally or otherwise, may have helped create a media environment where only favorable coverage was rewarded. While it's understandable that any organization would want to highlight its successes, using funding as leverage over editorial content raises ethical concerns, especially when public perception is shaped by those stories. One final example worth mentioning comes from Indonesia. Much like the previous cases, USAID invested in infrastructure and development projects in remote areas. The goal was to help communities access clean water and improve their quality of life. But as with Nigeria, many of the wells and boreholes built through these programs either dried up or malfunctioned within a short time. Reports of substandard materials and poor maintenance circulated, but received little media coverage, again raising questions about whether critical reporting was being quietly discouraged. One of the most talked about concerns is the alleged media coercion tied to USAID funding. This isn't about censorship in the traditional sense, but rather about subtle pressure placed on media outlets in return for financial support. In places like Ukraine, local journalists reportedly felt restricted in how they covered stories that involved USAID programs. In one case from 2015, after the country had suffered years of war and was still rebuilding, USAID provided funds to help restore essential services like education and healthcare. Alongside this, part of the funding was directed to local newspapers and television channels, with the expectation that they would report positively on the agency's involvement. However, several independent reporters suggested that criticism of the programs was strongly discouraged. While no direct orders were given, it was made clear that continued support depended on presenting USAID projects in a favorable light. This created an environment where issues like construction delays, corruption, or failed projects were rarely reported on, leading to an inaccurate or incomplete public understanding of what was actually happening. A similar situation occurred in Nigeria in 2018, when USAID funded water infrastructure in rural villages. The coverage of the events, largely pushed by local radio and media networks, focused heavily on the positive outcomes. But within months, some of the wells and boreholes built through these projects began to malfunction or dry up completely. Despite this, there was little follow-up in the media. Later reports suggested that criticism was avoided to maintain good relations with USAID, which continued to provide financial support to media partners. Again, while this may not have been a formal policy, the dynamic raised questions about how truly independent coverage can be when reporting is closely tied to funding. Critics argue that this kind of influence over media creates a false image of success and prevents real accountability. If mistakes are not being reported or discussed, then problems cannot be fixed, and the people most in need of support are the ones who suffer the consequences. Beyond media influence, another serious concern is USAID's role in foreign political situations. Over the past 2 decades, the agency has often been present in countries undergoing major political changes or civil unrest. One of the clearest examples of this is Egypt during the Arab Spring in 2011. For years, the U.S. had sent billions in aid to Egypt, much of it routed through USAID. The money was intended to support economic growth, strengthen civil institutions, and improve quality of life. However, large portions of the funding reportedly went to bolster Egypt's military and security forces, rather than support the public infrastructure that was desperately needed. When people took to the streets to protest against poverty, inequality, and a lack of basic services, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Critics later argued that by empowering the government and military with financial aid, USAID may have unintentionally contributed to the very conditions that led to public unrest. It's a stark reminder that even well-intentioned support can have unintended consequences if it's not carefully managed and transparently allocated. The same concerns have echoed in other regions, including Afghanistan. After years of US-led military involvement, USAID poured billions into the country to support reconstruction and stability. Roads were built, schools were funded, and development projects launched. But when foreign troops withdrew and local authorities took over, many of these resources were quickly lost or mismanaged. Reports indicated that some of the aid ended up in the hands of the same hostile groups the U.S. had originally aimed to remove. This raised difficult questions about the long-term effectiveness of development aid that lacks strong oversight and sustainability planning. Another example often cited is Georgia, where USAID has had a presence since the early 2000s. In 2003, the country saw major political upheaval during the Rose Revolution, a peaceful movement that led to the resignation of then-President Eduard Shevardnadze. At the time, many praised the revolution as a victory for democracy. But documents and investigations in the years that followed revealed that USAID had played a significant role in funding civil society groups and training political activists who were involved in the movement. While supporting democracy may seem like a noble goal, some saw it as direct political interference. The concern was not just about influencing outcomes, but about shaping the political landscape of a sovereign country in a way that aligned with U.S. interests. 5 years later, as Georgia faced growing tension with Russia, the situation escalated into armed conflict. Critics of USAID's involvement argued that external influence may have made diplomatic solutions more difficult and led to further instability. Ukraine presents another case that blends humanitarian goals with geopolitical strategy. Since 2014, USAID has sent billions of dollars to Ukraine in an effort to support democracy, fight corruption, and boost economic development. While many of these efforts were welcomed by Ukrainians, there have been ongoing claims that a portion of the aid was used to back specific political parties, particularly those aligned more closely with American policies and values. This support, whether intentional or not, contributed to a major shift in Ukraine's political alignment. The new government leaned more toward the West and away from Russia, worsening an already fragile relationship between the two countries. The tension eventually exploded into a full-scale conflict that has caused widespread suffering. Critics argue that USAID's role in shaping the political direction of Ukraine may have been a contributing factor to the current crisis, even if unintentionally. These stories lead us to a broader and perhaps more difficult question. What responsibility do aid agencies have when their actions, whether through funding, partnerships, or influence, end up deepening political divisions or fueling unrest? USAID's critics say the agency has too often blurred the lines between humanitarian work and political influence. Over the last 2 decades, they argue, it has been used as a tool of foreign policy rather than as a purely charitable organization. This claim is supported by incidents where aid funding appears to have supported opposition movements, enabled regime changes, or backed military institutions, rather than directly improving the lives of ordinary citizens. Another point that comes up repeatedly is the use and potential misuse of American taxpayer money. Between 2021 and now, USAID has reportedly spent close to $100 billion, with over half of that amount difficult to account for in terms of measurable impact. While audits exist, and some oversight mechanisms are in place, many critics say the current system is too complex and opaque for the average citizen to understand where their tax money is actually going. This becomes even more frustrating for Americans facing rising costs of living. As infrastructure at home continues to crumble, healthcare remains expensive, and student debt burdens millions, there's growing concern about whether the government's financial priorities are in line with the needs of its own people. Meanwhile, some foreign aid recipients have seen little long-term improvement despite the billions spent. Afghanistan, for example, received over $120 billion in aid, much of it routed through USAID. But the long-term results have been discouraging. Many of the roads, hospitals, and buildings funded by this aid have deteriorated or been destroyed. Corruption has taken root in some of the institutions meant to oversee development. For many American taxpayers, it's hard to reconcile the sacrifices they make with the limited results they see in return. Similar concerns have been raised in Africa and Latin America, where USAID has been accused of partnering with corrupt leaders or organizations, often with minimal transparency. The result is a situation where billions in taxpayer funds disappear into projects that don't seem to help those they're meant to serve. After more than 60 years of operation, USAID's reputation is now under greater scrutiny than ever. While it has undoubtedly done good in many parts of the world, the stories and allegations discussed across these 3 segments show that there is a need for greater transparency, accountability, and clarity about its true role in foreign affairs. As the world becomes more interconnected and as citizens become more informed, the demand for honest, effective aid is only going to grow. People want to know that their money is making a difference, for the right reasons and without hidden agendas. Whether USAID can meet that demand remains to be seen.